안녕하십니까. 오늘도 이른 아침 많이 나와주셔서 감사합니다. 그럼 지금부터 회의를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I believe one of the most frequently mentioned and talked about is the fourth industrial revolution nowadays, without fully understanding and appreciating the very comprehensive and very profound concept. Of course, key to the concept is technological change. And this morning we have the World Authority particularly regarding the technological change. So he will enlighten us the important aspects of the technological change. As the announcement was made, I will ask Dr. Song Kyung-jin, who will introduce speaker and moderate this morning's session. So with this, let me ask Dr. Song to introduce the speaker. Okay.
네, 안녕하십니까. 방금 소개받은 손경진입니다. Good morning, everyone. As Chairman Sagung mentioned, Dr. Frey is world-renowned authority on this issue of technology and employment. So he probably doesn't need an introduction. And I just learned he's getting more and more popular in Korea with Koreans and with a lot of Korean public and private institutions and organizations. Nonetheless, I'll make a very brief introduction to Dr. Carl Frey. Carl Frey is co-director of Oxford Martin Program on Technology and Employment. He's also associated with Citibank, as a Citi Fellow, and his research focuses on the transition of industrial nations to digital economies, and subsequently challenges for economic growth, labor markets, and urban development. And for him, it's important to secure the impact of his research. So he's been engaging in various policy advisory and media activities. And he has published quite a number of books and papers on technology and employment. And he also has been advising a lot of national governments as well as international organizations such as the UN, OECD, and etc. And as you can see, we have quite a number of journalists from different media companies today. Likewise, he's been widely quoted and his work has been widely covered by local as well as international media. With this brief introduction and without much further ado, I'd like to call upon Dr. Carl Frey to come forward and make your presentation as to what the future of work will look like.
Thank you very much, first of all, for your kind introduction. Thank you for your kind invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today and share with you some of the research we're doing at the Oxford Martin School, where we try to understand how technology, how artificial intelligence, digitization, mobile robotics is reshaping the world of work and what that means for us as individuals, as a society, and for growth and shared prosperity. I should say that I think it actually, in a way, all started here, because it was at the EGI last time I first presented in Korea, and I'm very happy to say that we've been here a few times since, so it's great to be back here, and I think you're very much at the forefront in thinking about this, and hopefully I will have a few new things to share with you as well, because we've been doing some research at the Oxford Martin School also since the last time, also very much looking into the political economy of technological change, because I think that is a particular aspect that is actually often being missed. So what I will do in my hour I have here is to give you an overview of the trends we see in technology, how we see that transforming labor markets, and what I believe that we should not and should worry about, because I think that the public perception around this topic has been reduced to, will there be enough jobs to go around? I don't think that's a prime concern, but I nevertheless think there are a lot of things to be concerned about. And when we discuss whether this is somehow different, it may actually be useful to start in the past, because this is not a new concern by any means. It is a concern that has been with us for a while. But this, that's down. Okay, perfect. No. Sure. So, is this better? Yes, okay. Perfect. I feel slightly shorter now. Yeah, I hope you can still see me. So, the great scientist Frederick Soddy once remarked that civilization is pursuing two precisely opposite goals at one at the same time. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, it invents new methods of abolishing labor, and on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, new labors to relieve the consequent unemployed. If we look at the historical record, there is no doubt that we've been tremendously productive on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Few in this audience will know anybody who works as an elevator operator, as a lamp lighter, as a switchboard operator, or for that matter, as a car washer. And only focusing on the occupations that have outright vanished usually understates the transformation that has happened. If you were to take a farm laborer from 1900 and drop him into today's farm, he would for the first time in his life encounter electricity, milking machines, automobiles, tractors, GPS technology, computers, you name it. It would probably take over a year to train him. And this is true of most occupations. They have changed so radically in content that they are still only recognizable on paper. So I would even go as far as saying that of the jobs that we used to have in 1900, nearly all of them have already actually been automated away. But despite this, it seems that we have more jobs than ever. Labor force participation has been constantly trading upwards. And I would argue that that is not just despite technological advances, but also in part due to technological advances. One key feature of the labour market, or the prime feature of the past 100 years, is the entry of women into the workforce. Nearly all of the upsurge, or I should say actually all of the upsurge, stems from women entering the labour market. And that, some empirical studies have shown, has in part at least to do with the mechanization of the household, with the adoption of electric appliances, with running water, with all these sort of things that mechanize the household and allowed women to move into the workforce and take on much more self-fulfilling paid jobs. I'm obviously not saying that this is all due to mechanization. It has to do with technological and social innovations alike. But what you can also see is that male workforce, labour force participation, had at the same time traded downwards. Now, part of that has to do with that male labour force participation was about 100%, and people had to work until they dropped. There was simply no social security and no other choice. But it also, to some extent, has to do with men losing their comparative advantage in the labour market. We used to have a comparative advantage in doing physical work, but as work has shifted in its content to become more cognitive, more social interactive, and most research actually in neuroscience show that women, especially when it comes to social tasks, have a comparative advantage over men. The comparative advantage in the labour market has shifted altogether. And you can see that especially since the 1980s, the age of robots and computers, there's been an acceleration in the downfall of male labour force participation. And some economists do believe that technology is one of the drivers behind that. I should say that there are only two things we know for sure. The first one is that the cost of computing, the cost of substituting human work for technology has declined very rapidly. You can see that every new computer technology since the first ones in the 1940s have been cheaper than their predecessors, with the possible exception of the iPad 2, which you can see is a bit of an outlier there. But the general trend is clear. It's becoming more and more economically feasible to substitute human work for technology. A second trend that is just as evident is that the potential scope of work that computers can do has expanded quite rapidly as well. If we go back to the early 20th century, distinguishing between tasks performed by humans and performed by computers would have been completely meaningless, because humans were computers. The computer was an occupation performing basic mathematical calculations. The division of labor between computers and humans only became meaningful in the 1940s with the first electronic computers that substituted for human activity in routine rule-based activities. But this is a very narrow type of tasks, right? Things like assembly, repetitive sorting, repetitive customer service, only things that we can actually specify in computer code was automatable and has been automatable since. But much more recently, what we see is an entirely new era of big data-driven technologies emerging. And what is so wonderful with big data is that now, for the first time in history, computers can learn themselves. We don't need a programmer to tell them what to do. They can learn to do medical diagnostics better than we do. They can learn to do document review better than we do. They can even outperform us at translation work. For all the flaws of Google Translator, it can translate between far more many languages than I can speak, at least. And it can even be found applications in mobile robotics, and is the reason that we will soon have autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars. And quite recently, we even see that computers outperform us at very complex things such as Go. I wouldn't even dare to try Go because it seems so complicated. Now computers are better than humans at it. So one of the questions we ask is, what are we then still good for? Because we are so imperfect in so many things we do. This is a study of Israeli judges and their decision making during the day, right? And you can see that after breakfast, when insulin levels are high, we tend to make a quite high share of favorable decisions. That then quite rapidly declines over the day until they have a morning snack, and then you see the same pattern again after lunch. Now, this is not how we want decisions to be made in society. So this makes me just more convinced that we need to automate just about everything we can. Fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, there are still things that we struggle to automate. So despite this expanding scope of automation, there is a variety of tasks where human workers still hold a comparative advantage. I should say I'm an economist by background, and I did not just invent these bottlenecks myself. So we had a close collaboration with the Engineering Sciences Department at Oxford University, the people that do mobile robotics, that actually develop autonomous vehicles, people that do information engineering actually develop the type of algorithms we see potentially can substitute for most knowledge work. And what they tell us is that these bottlenecks will persist for quite some time, right? With our current technological capabilities, there is no way that these things will be automated away. That is not to say that it couldn't happen at any point in the future. I'm just reading a brilliant book from the 1990s about the potential boundaries to automation, which is, was right in many ways and sort of a very accurate take on things at the time, but has today become completely irrelevant, actually, because so many things that they describe as impossible to automate are actually within the domains of computers. But we still think that these bottlenecks will be very, very difficult to overcome unless you have something like general artificial intelligence, and I'll come back to that later, but that seems to be quite far away. So the three key bottlenecks relate to creativity, complex social interactions, and the perception and manipulation of irregular objects. So if we take complex social interactions, for example, the state of the art is best described by the Turing test, where chatbots try to convince human judges of them actually being a person. And some people argue that there was a breakthrough last year when one chatbot managed to convince 30% of human judges of it actually being a person. But it did so by pretending to be a 13-year-old boy speaking English as his second language. And if you think about the variety of much more complex social interactions you all do in your daily jobs, where you try to persuade people to follow your ideas, you try and negotiate deals, you assist and take care of customers, you name it, right? This is just basic text communication. So we're very far off of actually being able to automate more complex social interactions. That is surely a domain where we will hold a comparative advantage, I believe, for quite some time. Creativity is difficult for similar reasons. We draw upon an enormous reservoir of tacit knowledge, of knowledge that we ourselves struggle to identify and point a finger to. And if you think about it, even amongst us, if we go to an art exhibition, we're all going to disagree on which pasting is most creative and what's nice and what's not, and there are sort of extreme subtleties associated with what actually is creative. And sure, there is software that is able to write classical music, and there are drawing machines. They do make drawings that are actually being exhibited modern, but more for the fact that they're done by a machine, I should say, than the actual art itself. But the point is this: if you give an algorithm 10 symphonies, and you tell them these are the greatest symphonies of all times, and they're all Mozart, sure, the algorithm has something to draw upon, and can come up with something new on the basis of that. But it's very unlikely to arrive at Stravinsky or Schoenberg. He's going to draw upon the existing knowledge, the existing data. You feed it, and in some instances, the borderline between what's creative and not is somewhat blurred. It's not entirely clear. So if you listen to the people at DeepMind that developed AlphaGo, they claim that AlphaGo is creative. Because one of the moves that AlphaGo actually did, which won it the match, it calculated himself that it would be 1 to 100,000 that it would actually win the match if it did that move, and the algorithm for some reason still did it. So DeepMind argues that this is a sign of creativity. But still, even in Go, there's a finite number of options. There's a finite number of moves you can do. And when things become completely open-ended, such as the arts and many domains associated with it, it's very different. And if we were to be slightly philosophical about it even, in the end of the day, we are the ones deciding at the marketplace what's creative or not with our purchase decisions. So for computers to outperform us at creativity, they would not just have to be better computers, but also increasingly human. And I still think that is something where we will hold the comparative advantage at. The final bottleneck, I should say, is slightly more mundane. So it relates to the perception and manipulation of irregular objects. So for me, if I may, to pick up this glass of water, that's a very straight thing to do, right? But for a robot to do it, well, the first thing you need to do is that you need to distinguish it from the background in order to pick it up, which is quite difficult in this case because it's transparent. You can see through it, right? And the second thing you need to do is that you need to apply the right amount of pressure when you pick it up in order not to break it. And you can surely teach a robot to do precisely that task over and over again. But if you think about the variety of complex objects you have in your homes, it's almost inconceivable that we will have a general purpose technology that can navigate your homes, identify all these different objects lying around, and yet sort of pick up and manipulate them, right? Task simplification may to some extent help in this. So if you think about the automation of laundresses, right? We didn't automate laundry by building a robot that could walk out from the kitchen and then carry in buckets of water into the home and do it all by hand, right? We automated laundry by developing the washing machine that does sort of a completely different set of motions, and we could still not build a robot that could walk out and carry in the water for us, right? So by task and simplification, we can elevate some of this, right? And that is what Amazon has been quite successfully doing in its warehouses, but it relates to having the luxury of building structured environments in which we can navigate, right? We have to rebuild our homes completely to accommodate electricity and all these wonderful gadgets, right? And as we go along, maybe we will rebuild our homes again to make the automated, cleaner a possibility. But for now, I think we're not going to just tear down the entire city of Seoul and rebuild it from scratch again. So in the near future, we suggest that the automated maid or cleaner is very unlikely to happen. Now, a key question then that emerges from this is how intensive then are jobs actually in tasks that correspond to these engineering bottlenecks? How much complex social interactions, how much creativity, how much sort of manipulation of irregular objects do today's jobs actually require? We find that actually, well, this is in the US context, but the shares are quite similar for other advanced economies as well. So in the US context, we find that roughly 47% of jobs are not very intensive in tasks that correspond to these engineering bottlenecks. And the automatability of jobs is no longer by any means just confined to production or clerking back office work. It spans across logistics, warehousing, construction, sales, services, you name it. Nearly every domain is to some extent affected by the expanding scope of automation, or what some people refer to as the fourth industrial revolution. I'm not a fan of that term because I think there's very little industrial about it. Unlike the first industrial revolution and the second industrial revolution that made it to do with manufacturing, the fourth industrial revolution has mainly to do with actually the automation of services. I would argue that's more a de-industrial revolution than an industrial one. But I think that's probably more of a theoretical debate. Anyhow, needless to say, that something can be automated does not mean that it will inevitably be automated, right? Relative costs between capital and labor matters. When Nissan produces cars in India, it relies heavily on cheap labor. When it does exactly the same thing in Japan, it relies heavily on robotics. Legislation matters as well. Even if Google Translate becomes perfect, right? There are still certain official documents which you need to be certified by a translator, right? Unless you give Google Translate a certification, it's not going to substitute for translators in those domains. And the same is true when it comes to driverless cars, right? It needs a driver's license before it's allowed to drive. And culture preference matter hugely as well. In Japan, robots are being used in elderly care. In Sweden, where I come from, that would be unthinkable. It would be a public outcry if we were to have robots in elderly care. Oh my goodness. So all of these things matter to the potential pace of automation. So I think it's fair to say that we have an idea about what the potential scope is, but what the pace is a very different question. And when you hear sort of headlines that Boston Consulting Group estimates that by 2025, 4 million new jobs are going to will be created and 3 million will be displaced, I would urge you to think that there's no way they can know that. So without even having to pick up the report, you can say they don't know what they're talking about. So I think that this is roughly the sort of state of the art of our knowledge. The potential scope of automation has expanded quite rapidly. That spells good news for the potential future productivity growth, because if we can automate a lot of things, it means that we can become more productive. But it depends on institutions, it depends on the relative cost of capital and labor, and our cultural preferences, how fast this will actually happen. But if history provides any guidance, things tend to be automated away eventually when they become automatable. So should we then be worried about this? Should we somehow be worried that 47% of jobs are going to disappear, half of the workforce are going to be unemployed, or we will somehow, have to go into early retirement or cut working hours, or we will have to introduce a basic income to make sure that there's not mass starvation? That's roughly sort of the perception you often get by reading the papers. One of the most astounding facts of the past 100 years, I was shocked when I read this, is that compensation has grown by 800%. The amount of extra income we take out in leisure has grown by 10%. We've become enormously much wealthier, but still we seem very happy to work. In fact, if we go back 100 years, right, we could probably automate everything we did back then, right? And to maintain that standard of living with today's technology, we could just work until early April and then take the rest of the year off and enjoy our leisure. And we decided not to do that. Question is why? My answer would be because sadly, whether you like it or not, we're greedy. We're happy to work a few longer hours for those hot yoga classes. We're happy to work a few extra hours to travel across the world. We're happy to work more to go to fancy restaurants. And in the end of the day, that greed also creates jobs. So I believe that as long as there are things that we can't automate, that we still demand, there will be enough jobs to go around. There's been a lot of focus on the 47%. You heard a lot less about the other 53%, right? 47% is automatable. This means that 53% are not. That leaves a lot of scope for reallocation just into existing jobs. And needless to say, if you were to go back 100 years and ask somebody to predict what's going to happen over the next 100 years and what people will do for a living, they are quite unlikely to suggest that, well, they're probably going to work in software engineering or tourism or nanotechnology. You know, we can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but we can say as long as there's human demand for goods and services, we can't produce. The quantity of jobs is unlikely to be a problem. A much greater concern, I believe, is whether the vast majority of the population will be reaping the benefits from technological progress. That's a very different question. What you can see here is, this is in the context of the United States, but also true for most advanced economies, but what you can see there is that hourly compensation kept roughly pace with productivity for about a century. Even before the days of labor unions, even during the Gilded Age, compensation grew roughly in tandem with productivity. Since the age of computers, there's been a great decoupling. And the reason for that is being debated. Some suggest it has more to do with trade, so import competition. And some people suggest that it has more to do with technology. I think economists is more and more coming to the conclusion that it actually mainly has to do with technological change. Because if you take China, the impact from China started roughly around 2000, right? And this trend predates the rise of China, for example. So labor is no longer really reaping the benefits from technological change it used to be. If you look at the composition of the workforce, things get even grimmer. So one of the key features of technological change over recent years is that it has been routine biased. And jobs that are intensive in routine rule-based activities tend to cluster in the middle of the income distribution. And those jobs have been automated away. So you've seen a downfall, if you like, of the middle class in almost every advanced economy. People that have a college degree have done quite well. They reallocated into more skilled professional service jobs where they have earned better wages. People without a college degree have fared worse. They shifted into low-skill, low-income service jobs such as waitering and those sorts of things, right? So they've been a net loser of technological change. The same is true when you look at the introduction of industrial robotics in manufacturing. There's a recent paper by Asimoglu and co-authors which shows that in regions in the United States where robots were more adopted more extensively, those areas experienced net declines in employment and net wage reductions, right? People have even dropped out from the workforce as a result of technological change. So even if it's made us better off on average, a sizable fraction of the workforce has in fact lost out. And this is not the first time we've seen this. Now, we tend to think of the British Industrial Revolution as this great, wonderful event that made us all wealthier, and it's the main turning point in human history. And it's true, right? It was the Industrial Revolution that allowed us to escape the life that Thomas Hobbes referred to as nasty, brutish, and short. But in the short run, life got even nastier, more brutish, and even shorter, right? And the reason for that, as the factory displaced the domestic system, the artisan man was displaced. He lost his comparative advantage in production because the early machines were made more suitable for them to be tended by women and children. Children worked for a fraction of the wage of the male artisan. And you can see that when it comes to economic trends, the age of computers has been strikingly similar to the first couple of decades of the Industrial Revolution, although that you see that volatility has been going down quite significantly over recent years, which I guess is a good thing. But overall, the trend is that the labor share of income was falling, just as this has been now, and average wages were stagnant, or for part of the workforce, even declining. And the puzzle for economists and economic historians is then, why on earth would a sizable fraction of the population in Britain have agreed to the introduction of the factory system if it reduced their utility? Well, the easy answer is they did not. It was a wave of riots across Britain, one after another. And how did the British government respond? It responded by sending out 12,000 troops to squash the riots. The army that Wellington sent against Napoleon in 1808 was smaller than the one sent against the Luddites. So the easy answer is that they had little choice. And a lot of people often forget that the Industrial Revolution, this wonderful episode in history, started with the construction of the factories. It ended with the construction of the railroads, but also with the publication of the Communist Manifesto. So revolutionary technologies brought political revolutionaries along the way. What we're seeing now is a similar tendency, but with one big difference. People no longer vote with sticks and stones. They can show at the general elections. And there was a machinery riot last year in the United States, which was called the 2016 US presidential elections. Our findings show that when you look at robot adoption in the United States, and you look at the propensity of a worker to opt for Donald Trump over Mitt Romney in the last general election, had robot penetration been 2% lower, if we run a counterfactual analysis, had robot penetration been 2% lower in the United States over that period, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin would have swung in favor of Hillary Clinton, and she would have ended up with a majority in the Electoral College. Now, I'm obviously not suggesting that people thought, well, my job is about to be displaced by a machine, so therefore I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. I certainly don't believe that was the logic. He barely mentioned technology at all. What I'm suggesting is that people that have lost out to technology are much more prone to opt for radical political change. They want anything but the status quo. And Donald Trump was unquestionably the president of change. 85% of Americans, according to the exit polls, believed that Donald Trump would outperform Hillary in bringing about change. And I think it's important to realize that there's a big difference between technological unemployment and other types of unemployment. If you lost your craft skill, it means that your human capital is industrially bankrupt, right? Even if you start working at the restaurant, you have some advantage if you have experience. If you start from scratch, you're going to start at a lower wage, or you might even drop out from the workforce altogether. That doesn't mean that the demand for jobs have gone down, but these people's skill sets have been made redundant. And Donald Trump promised to bring all of these wonderful jobs back. So evidently, who wouldn't go for that? It sounds very simple solutions, right? So at times where people lose out for automation, we tend to opt for more radical political change. And I think that this is a tendency that is only going to become much more pronounced, because in the past election, or when we just look at industrial robotics, first of all, it's just a fraction of the workforce that are actually affected by them, right? When we look at the forthcoming deindustrial revolution, what we see is that with artificial intelligence, with mobile robotics, nearly every service economy is becoming exposed as well. It used to be that technological change as trade mainly affected the tradable sector of the economy. What we're seeing now is every location in the United States is exposed to technological change. And if more and more people actually lose out to automation, I would suspect that more and more people are actually going to opt for a more radical political change as well. Let me also suggest that when I worry about this tendency, I actually worry more about the developing world than I worry about advanced economies. The simple reason being that we have already made the transition. Some of you may be familiar with Danny Roderick's important work on premature deindustrialization. The fact that manufacturing employment in countries like China, India, and Brazil has already peaked at significantly lower levels than it peaked in the West. It has peaked below 20%. In the West, manufacturing employment peaked to somewhere between 35 and 40%. So simply shifting low-skilled workers from agriculture to manufacturing may not be a path to prosperity that is open to most countries any longer. And that has a lot to do with technology. If you think about some of the key technological revolutions of the 20th century, they were the telephone, the computer, the container ship. All of those technologies allowed companies to structure supply chains in a way that they could take advantage of cheap labor. What we're seeing now with factory automation is that companies can save transportation costs, move production closer to domestic markets to automated factories. That is hugely going to deteriorate the comparative advantage many of these countries have, which is cheap labor. Another historical fact is that there used to be a very tight correlation between industrialization and urbanization. That correlation has today largely broken down. And the reason for that is Africa. Africa has huge cities, huge service economies that have emerged just around the extraction of natural resources. Once those natural resources run out, the Europeans will put the current migration crisis in perspective, because it's nothing to compare to what's coming. And on the continent altogether, there was a report recently suggesting 8% of Africans actually work in industry. It's a very, very small number. So I believe that these places are at most risk to automation. And that is not even considering the forthcoming deindustrial revolution and the fact that they are still specialized in jobs that we could automate for the past 100 years, right? So Ethiopia, 85% exposed to automation. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of these jobs are going to be automated away in the next 10 years. It simply says that in Ethiopia, a lot of people still specialize in agriculture. And the reason for that, obviously, is that we find a very strong negative correlation between the skill level and whether a job is susceptible to automation or not. So low-skill, low-income jobs are the most susceptible to automation looking forward, and it stands to reason from that countries that specialized in low-skilled work are most exposed to automation from that as well. Meanwhile, we find that new type of jobs, new types of industries are emerging. So if we look at official classifications of industries, we can track the industries that didn't exist in official classifications in 2000 and for the first time emerged in 2010, and we can see how many people they employ and so on and what the characteristics of those workers are. I should say that most of those industries relate to either digital technology or biotech, and the workers they employ are much more skilled than the average US population, much more likely to have a bachelor degree, much more likely to have a PhD, much more likely to have a STEM degree, earn almost twice the US median wage. Not very sort of straightforward always to shift into those type of jobs. And at the same time, we see that these jobs are also highly clustered. New jobs tend to cluster in skilled locations, such as San Francisco, such as Seoul, such as Munich, Stockholm, and so on. So we're seeing a growing polarization of the economy, where on the one hand, low-skilled jobs are being automated away in some locations, and new jobs, skilled jobs, are clustering in skilled cities. And that means that even the low-skilled jobs are emerging in those places, because they tend to be jobs in the local service economy. And what happens when a new skilled high-tech job is created in one city, that creates roughly 4 new low-skilled service jobs in the economy. So the world is clearly not flat, right? Despite this idea that we can, use digital technology to work from the beach or wherever, economic activity is actually becoming increasingly clustered, and that is leading to an increasingly polarized world, I believe. Now, I would like to end by saying that I wouldn't completely exclude the possibility that over time technology could reduce the overall demand for jobs as well. We saw that in the past with the case of the horse, which was gradually displaced in artillery, in transportation and in agriculture, and has today largely been reduced to ceremonial purposes. 2 things I should add to that, though. The first thing is that humans are not horses, which I think goes without saying. We managed to adapt by acquiring new skills, but if we have something like general artificial intelligence, which was suggested by at the World Knowledge Forum yesterday, technology could potentially outperform us in all the domains and leave us redundant. But even then, horses could not vote. We can. So it's still in our hands to shape society on the better, for the better on that basis. And I think that it will be a challenge, but not an unsolvable one. And I'd like to leave you with that thought. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Carl, for ending up your presentation with a very positive comment. And I'm relieved this morning that there'll be enough jobs to go around for everyone, let alone the quality of jobs. And it was indeed enlightening that you gave us a new perspective on the political economy landscape that has changed with the fact that everyone has one vote. And also it has a special relevance to and direct implication for Korea, because Korea, as you know, has the highest rate of automation in the world. We have about 530, I guess, robots per 10,000 workers in the manufacturing area. So that's an issue. And you also said women will do better, I hope, in this new age. And given the fact that Korea has one of the lowest women labor market participation rate in the OECD, it's far below than the OECD average by 10 percentage point. So that's a good news for Korean women. And It's good that you mentioned education, proper and appropriate education will still be the most important factor in this new age, this new technological age. And the polarization of jobs and cities will create, I guess, a big social, not just economic, but social and political problem, which may eventually lead to worsening inequality in the country. And there will be more, according to your presentation, there will be more gap between advanced and developing countries down the road. I guess these are the main points you have presented, shared with us this morning. With that short wrap up, I'd like to open the floor to get your questions. Yes, Dr. Lim.
Monyak Lim from KBI. I'd like to ask a question about the political economy of future of work. You mentioned the Luddites and the Communist Manifesto, sort of stopped at that, but in the 19th century, the labor movement produced the Labor Party and so on. And if you think about it, it accommodated technological change, need for human capital development, at the same time fought for shorter working hours, higher wages and so on. But in the present time, the new labor rights and think tanks and so on have been failing. And instead, as you pointed out, Trump won the election, right? But going forward, if you were to make an analogy, analogy to the labor movement dealing with the threat of automation, what do you see as a possible political response to automation that is different from Trump and promising to bring the jobs back, but rather promising to bring the jobs back, but actually going ahead with tax cuts, healthcare cuts, and so on, and actually what would be a kind of an effective labor response that's on par with the labor response in the 19th century?
Thank you for that question. I guess, is this working? No. I guess you rightly acknowledged that I skipped roughly 100 years of history there and jumped from the Industrial Revolution to Donald Trump. And rightly, the political economy of technological change doesn't just sort of depend on the rate of technological progress. It depends on how, to what extent people benefit from technology. I think what economists refer to as the Great Leveling, the period from 1990 to 1970, was in fact very much the result of technology, and not surprisingly so much. Well, I should obviously give the labor movement some credit as well. But if you look at when the year that Marx published the Communist Manifesto, if you look at the Gini coefficient for Britain, that was actually exactly when things turned. So even in a market economy, you started to see inequality falling. And the British Industrial Revolution actually remarkably looks like a Kuznets curve, where sort of inequality first decreases and then sort of levels off. And I don't think there's anything inevitable about technology, technological change, that it has to bring about a Kuznets curve, or that it has to be, like Piketty suggests, sort of a steady state, unequal society. I think that technology works in mysterious ways, right? During the Industrial Revolution, technological change was initially de-skilling, so substituted skilled workers for unskilled workers, and capital biased. During the most part of the Second Industrial Revolution, technological change was skill biased, and inequality would have surged if it wasn't for education increasing the supply of skilled workers as well. So the supply of skilled workers even outpaced the demand for it over the Great Levelling. And what we've seen since the 1980s is that technological change has been routine biased. It's replaced routine workers. It's been skill biased. It helps skilled workers, and it's been capital biased as well. So I think it very much depends on the direction of technological change. And I think that if we start to upskill the workforce to a greater extent, because supply demand has been running ahead of supply for quite some time now when it comes to skills, that would certainly help. And I think there is a generational dilemma associated with technological change as well, which is that older workers always struggle. Even if they reskill, compare hiring policies often favor sort of younger workers that are willing to work at lower wages, and the next generation tends to adapt quite well. So I'm not suggesting that this is a trend that is inevitable and going to continue forever, but it has been the case since the 1980s, and we see that with expanding scope of automation, it is likely that technology is going to continue to take the form of capital that substitutes for workers, and unless we manage to keep the supply of educated workers in tandem with demand, inequality, also wage inequality, I think is going to continue to grow. But needless to say, I'm not, a determinist when it comes to the future. I think it very much depends on responses.
Any questions? Yes, Dr. Lee.
Thank you. I'm Byung Lee. I think the political dynamics in the age of automation will dictate the increasing welfare expenditure in both advanced and emerging developing economies alike. Do you agree with my observation on that?
It's an interesting question, so I'm not sure it applies to every place. It's quite striking. So a Pew Research survey came out recently, and it suggests that roughly 85% of you Americans believe that the government should restrict automation to jobs that are hazardous and people don't want to do. So they would be in favor of restricting automation. Then when it comes to questions about the government actually doing something about it, everybody's all of a sudden against it, right? So we want change, but not by the government. In Sweden, it's very different, right? We want more government involvement, and we want a bigger welfare state, and so on. At least in the past, the Swedes have been happy to sort of go for welfare spending when it's perceived to be needed. And in many developing countries, I'm not sure to what extent it can be afforded. So I believe that sort of this age of automation can come with quite a few surprises. And I think that Donald Trump may retrospectively be seen like a logical candidate from an automation point of view. At least you can understand why he was elected, right? But would we have expected that 2 years ago? I'm not sure. So I think it's very, very unpredictable.
Any other? Bridget, I know you have a question.
I think, yeah, for me, again, it's probably the whole gender balance as well.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. It's at the moment, I think this is for sure something which shows, but for me it's also linked to probably education. And we're looking at that we need to have more higher education. On the other hand, it's developing so fast, and the schooling system and education system has challenges to keep up with the speed of what actually is needed on is it again now in so how do you see these challenges for the future and potentially again people learning by themselves through internet and actually going to school? It's also probably a trend coming up, right? Because in the past with opening in the garage, inventing the Microsoft, and it looks like with the speed it could even happen more and more in the future. What is your opinion on education?
It's a great question. So I'm not one of those who think that sort of education needs to be rethought from scratch, which tends to be a sort of frequent observation. I think we're sort of doing quite well in many regards, and if I, coming from a university, if I may do some marketing for the place I'm at, the reason I believe that Oxford University has existed for 800 years, and the reason I think it's going to exist for another 800, is that we have the tutorial system. And the fact that we teach students in smaller groups to work on sort of real-world problems, write essays, interact, think in creative ways. And I think sort of social interactions and creativity is becoming more and more important. And I think the best way to teach that is to debate and read and discuss and write. And I think the tutorial system is perfect in that regard. The main downside to it is that it's terribly expensive. So hopefully we can actually leverage to some extent digital technology to facilitate the learning process, because what some studies show is when it comes to just absorbing knowledge, online students perform as well as on-campus students. And quite naturally, sort of an online lecture has a pause button, a rewind button. You can watch the lecture as many times you like. And it also offers huge potential, because there's a lot of inequality in the access to schooling actually across locations. Where you grow up matters enormously for which school you go to and your later chances in life. And by making education available through national platforms for everyone, I think there's a lot that could potentially be gained from that. And to finally touch upon the gender side of things, I think that the comparative advantage is gradually shifting in the labour market in favor of women. What is maybe a slightly worrying tendency is that very few women enroll in STEM degrees, and STEM degrees are becoming more important. So hopefully we see a shift there as well, but for the time being we don't see that shift.
Any other questions? 참고로 저희 통역도 있으니까 한국말로도 질문 가능합니다. 질문해 주십시오. 네.
네, 감사합니다. 한국말로 통역 부탁드립니다. 프레이 교수님 잘 들었습니다. 어제 그 베이직 인컴에 대한 세션에서도 지식 포럼의 그 베이직 인컴에 대한 세션에서도 좋은 말씀 많이 들었는데요. 그 어제와 오늘 들은 그 강연 내용 중에 제가 공통적으로 느낀 포인트 중에 하나가 교수님께서는 그 앞으로 그 그러니까 산업 현상이 많이 일어나도 사람들의 어떤 일 욕심 때문에, 인간의 일 욕심 때문에 여가가 별로 생기지 않을 것이다. 어제 오늘 말씀하신 것 중에 많이 산업화가 되고 로봇 오토마이제이션이 돼도 사람들이 여가가 더 늘어나는 것이 아니고 끊임없이 인간이 일을 하고자 하는 욕심이 있다, 이런 표현 강조를 많이 하셨어요. 그렇다면 사람들은 이렇게 기계 사용과 여가 산업화를 통해서 좀 더 라이프 퀄리티를 높이고자 하는 그런 바람이 있는데 교수님은 그것에 대한 전망이 별로 없다 이렇게 생각하시는 건지, 그 점이 어제 오늘 좀 궁금했습니다.
Well, I didn't mean to suggest that things are necessarily going to continue like it's been the last 100 years forever, but it's a simple observation that is striking how little time we decided to take out in leisure despite us becoming so much wealthier. And I think that, you know, in the best of all worlds, we would have this choice, right? Some people can take out more time in leisure and you know, work less, and some people that are greedy and want to work more can do that. So, maximum amount of freedom in deciding how much you are able to work would probably be the ideal solution. But in the end of the day, I think this basic income discussion has just gotten completely out of hand. People prescribe basic income as the solution to absolutely everything, and I think it results often in lazy thinking and simple solutions to complex problems. So I slightly regret the amount of attention the basic income topic has been receiving lately.
네. 또 any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Thank you. This is Yang Park. Thank you for the nice talk. So I'd like to ask you a point of view that there are some areas that what computers cannot do, such as creativity and social intelligence and perception and manipulation. But for me, in the next 10 or 20 years, artificial intelligence will make a remarkable development so that they will have some kind of very high level of creativity and in some sense social intelligence because they will learn by themselves. So some say that, such as the Kurzweil say that there will be a kind of singularity coming in 2040. That in that area, it is quite kind of radical point of view that we will be the last age which will die, or maybe the first age, first generation which will not die. Yes, because there will be a very high level of development in this biotechnology and also this kind of implementing chips in human brain. So, but it seems like that you are kind of predicting that there will not be that much change in some sense in the next 20 years. So, do you think that with this, you don't like the term, the sports revolution, but with this rapid development of this artificial intelligence and big data, etc., in the next 30 years, at the time I will be about in the 80s, that we will be living in a very different environment in society. How do you think about that?
And let us get one more from the back.
Morning, my name is Jung Won Kim. I used to work for the World actually which anticipates that gloomy picture of the loss, the changing job landscape. But since I'm not an economist, but I don't know the exact definition of term, something like job, employment, and labor. But the future of job, future of employment, and future of labor, I think these has a different landscape, I would say. But I have two questions. First one is that different type of job, something like a gig economy, maybe the kind of complement to the changing job landscape. So I would like to know your thoughts about the gig economy in terms of UK or American case. And second one is that for the last couple of decades we only talk about the globalization. So because the human civilization can be advanced through the migration, like the service, goods, and human. But now we are not focusing on the automation only. But I want to know the relation between the immigration and then the future job, because the Korea and East Asia, has facing a lot of the aging society problems. So the immigration can be the kind of the another matters to think about when it comes to the future job.
All excellent questions, thank you. I think, when it comes to singularity, people have been predicting roughly what Ray Kurzweil is predicting for the past 40 years, which doesn't say that he's wrong, but look, I'm an economist by background. I don't, there are limits to what I can predict, and I inform my analysis, but on what most people that work in machine learning and artificial intelligence say. And they don't necessarily believe that the singularity is going to happen in the next 20 years, which is roughly our timeline. I don't know whether that is going to happen or not, but I know if it actually would happen, the future of work would probably be one of our lesser problems, because everything you can possibly think of would become so unpredictable that I may even be out of a job myself. So we have a robot thinking about the future of work for us. So no, I'm slightly skeptical, and I think you can't sort of plan for the future on the basis of something that might not or could potentially happen sometime in the distant future. So I think that it's good that some people think about the potential of the singularity and what could happen then, but I'm not one of those, and being an economist, I'm not sure if it would be a very good use of my time if I were to think long and hard about that. To the second question on migration, I mean, what we're seeing with automation, I believe, is sort of, to some extent, deglobalization. And that is a process that hasn't really started yet, but I think it's the potential that technology actually offers, is that you, with 3D printing and automated factories and all of these things, that you can move production much closer to yourself, save transportation costs, it's better for the environment, and to some extent that might mean less migration. But as you correctly point out, a lot of the migration has to do with either service jobs mainly that are needed, and I still think will be needed in some time from now. And people or countries have very different demographic outlooks, right? In some places, migration is going to be vastly or hugely needed. In other places, it may lead to wage pressures on certain groups, which seems to be one of the factors potentially behind the populist backlash in Europe, although I think the evidence is quite inclusive on that, inconclusive, I should say. So I don't think we're witnessing the end of migration, but I think we are moving towards a sort of a gradual deglobalization driven by technology.
Yes.
I'm Yong Lim, and I teach competition law at Seoul National University. I found, I'm not an economist, and I don't do labor law, but I found your talk very interesting. One question that came to mind, because I understood your point this morning to be what's different between the Industrial Revolution and today is that we have voting rights, and that the electorate may tamper or harness the technology or the change that's coming toward a more beneficial way so that we could avoid the fate of horses. One thing that came to my mind under that scenario is two problems. One is that how reasonable or how reliable is the electorate in general in terms of deciding our fates with the advent of fake news and the seemingly manipulable public opinion. The second challenge that I thought regarding that scenario is we vote against Washington, Brussels, Yeouido, the Blue House here. So that's where we exercise our voting rights, whereas the actual the actual power or the actual influence is in Silicon Valley, Boston, and elsewhere. And so there seems to me not only a shift in technology, but actually a shift of power from the seats of the traditional power to other places, for example, in Silicon Valley. And so does that scenario work? The attempt of the electorate to sort of temper that change or to respond to those threats would be indirect, because we would have to rely on Brussels or Washington to rein in Silicon Valley or guide them. But it seems to me that Washington and Brussels the knowledge gap is growing, They simply do not know, as you pointed out. And so, what trust can we put into the electorate? First of all, to be reasonable. The second of all, to make sure that their voting rights or their voting acts actually influence the outcome.
It's another great question. So I think, first of all, it's quite difficult to generalize an answer to that because every country has very different political institutions. But I think you frame your questions towards the United States and Europe in particular. So maybe let's focus on those. And I think one wonderful thing is that the U.S. Constitution seems to work quite well, right? So one judge, by signing a piece of paper, abolished one of Trump's most controversial policies. So I think it's in our interest that we actually have a constitution that in some sense actually maintains the status quo against too radical change, actually. But I think that, I'm certainly not going to defend President Trump, but I think that people that actually voted for him had, to some extent, reasons to do so, because they've been losing out to technological change and globalization for quite some time, and I think that people are gradually actually coming to terms with that we need to do something about it, or there's going to be a second term of Trump and you don't know who's coming next, and you see a populist uprising in Europe. And I still think, well, it's hard to ignore. And in the end of the day, nobody is going to accept a society that is so unequal, whereas 5% own a couple of robots and the rest live impoverished, and all the wealth go to Silicon Valley. So I would argue that there is some tipping point, but I agree. I'm quite impressed that people have put up as long as they have. And if you look at Greece in Europe, right? I would have thought would have been a revolution there by now, but people are seemingly willing to take more than you think. And yes, in the day of fake news and all of that, that has important implications and has something to do with this polarization that we're seeing as well, because somebody that lives in Detroit has a very different Facebook feed than somebody that lives in Manhattan, New York, and that is sort of amplifying again the polarization we're seeing. So no, I think there are good reasons to be concerned about the future of democracy as well, but I still think it's the best system we have, and I sort of think that over the long run I don't see sort of world entirely dominated by Silicon Valley and everybody else obeying the new sort of digital rules. So I think that democracy still has a role to play.
Yes, Ms. Kim from UNICEF. Yes.
Good morning. I'm Soo-Han Kim. I'm the head of the UNICEF office in Korea. I'd like to take us back to the question of education, and because that's the next generation where our investment should lie in. You did mention that Oxford University is leading this process, but I'd like to get your thoughts on, is that enough? We're still basing our education on the Industrial Revolution. Our subject matters are based on math, English, science, biology, so forth. Is that enough? Because if we look at the kind of jobs that will be in the market in the future, they're more related to soft skills that we don't teach at school anymore. Networking, problem solving, as you mentioned, creative thinking. All of these are not exactly featured into the education system. At higher level, but also tertiary education maybe, but not the secondary. What are your thoughts on how we prepare our children for the next generation who will be facing these challenges? What are some of the advice you can give? That's my first question. The second question is, you did mention that there will be inequality. There will be better people with better gains and higher gains, whereas there will be inequality where there will be people who lose out. Your job, obviously, is a very good job. It's a higher end job. Do you see yourself in your job 10 years from now?
You have to ask my employer about the last question. I'm not sure if I'm qualified to comment. I think when it comes to teaching social and creative skills, my view is that you don't need a class on creativity. It's about the ways you teach. So through creative teaching methods, you can bring in creativity and social interaction into the learning process. And that's what I think is a wonderful thing about the tutorial system, that regardless of whether you study philosophy or chemistry or law, the tutorial system forces you to be creative and socially engaged. So I think it's about learning methods and not having particular classes on creativity as well.
And I think
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, before you close, I'm very curious to know what's your view on so-called productivity conundrum. Despite all this technological change and everything, Robert Gordon and all the economists' estimation, it doesn't show up in the statistics of productivity. How you interpret that, and is it a measurement problem or these surges coming? What's your view on this?
Another great question. So I think the productivity puzzle has been a humbling experience for most economists, and I think that nobody understands it fully. But it seems to me that it's not only a measurement problem, at least, right? I mean, first of all, as Robert Gordon rightly points out in his book, we've always been bad at measuring productivity, and if you look at the T-Ford, it only entered, the price index 10 years after it was first developed, and there's a lot of things that we failed to measure about productivity for a century. And if you look at other indicators of technological dynamism, such as job relocation, has been trending downwards as well, and new business formation trending downwards. So regardless of what sort of indicator you look at, it seems that productivity is slowing. My interpretation of this is speculative, but I do think the reason is that we've run out of steam when it comes to the automation of routine work. If you look at sort of the hollowing out of routine jobs, you can see that that has actually declined quite rapidly over the 2000s. So I think we've been running into engineering bottlenecks to automation, and many of the technologies that we're discussing about the sort of forthcoming fourth industrial revolution, we only see on paper. So there are no driverless cars on the streets of Seoul. IBM's Watson has been trained as a medical doctor, but it's not in use in most hospitals. And I think in the past, sort of the experience has been that productivity gains come, with a significant time lag. So if you take the electrification of the first factories, for example, when the electric motor arrived, the first thing you did is that you simply displaced the steam engine as the central source of power. But then sort of gradually you figured out that, well, actually you can put an electric motor on every machine, and that allows you to sequence production in a way that allows you to have an assembly line and sort of pave the way for mass production, right? And in the same way, I think the new technologies that we're seeing now, workplaces need to be restructured to accommodate those technologies. And I think that was also what happened with the productivity upsurge in the late 1990s with sort of, business process management and Michael Hammer saying we need to obliterate the old processes. But after a while, we reconfigured the office to accommodate computer technology. I think the same is going to be required for artificial intelligence, and the productivity boost is yet to come. Whether that is going to, productivity boost is going to be more significant than that what we had in the early 20th century with automobiles and electricity and all of that, I'm not sure. So I think it's slightly exaggerated, sort of this artificial intelligence hype, because if you read about what actually happened in the early 20th century, it's striking, right? The complete transformation of the home, electricity, running water, indoor plumbing, right? It's transformed the home, the office, the factory, transportation with the automobile. For the first time, so you can travel around and go new places, and the airline industry around the world. I mean, transformation has been extraordinary. So I think that this time around it will maybe be transformative. If it's going to be as transformative or not, I'm not entirely sure, but it's going to be very transformative indeed. My worry is that technology is more taking the form of capital that substitutes for labor, rather than leading to sort of new these product innovations like the automobile and the telephone and the things that we usually value. But at the same time, I think the generation of Robert Gordon, and gradually also the generation of myself, doesn't really appreciate the value a lot of young people attach to sort of the smartphones and new video games or whatever it is, and virtual reality. I'm very unexcited about it at time being, because it's simply not good enough yet, but I'm sure it will be good enough at some point, and I think that's going to be hugely transformative. So so I think that productivity gains are yet to come, and I think that the productivity puzzle has to do with the fact that we run into bottlenecks of automation, and we need to restructure work process to accommodate them.
Okay, the same technological feasibility and adaptation are two different things. And it's good that we will have enough jobs in the future, according to Carl Frey. The thing is, whether or not our workforce all of our workforce will have enough skills, sufficient skills to take the new jobs. So that's where as Ms. Kim said, the importance of education comes in. And according to somebody's statistics, some scholars study in Korea, we have, since the establishment of the Korean government, we have only 7.9, out of all the ministers and vice ministers so far, only 7.9% are STEM majors. So we need, more social roles for children, for next generation to learn from. And in that sense, the educational curriculum, at least in Korea, I'm not sure about the Oxford case, but at least in Korea, we need a drastic overhaul in the educational curriculum. Well, with that, I think it's time that we should let you go. And it's been a great pleasure to have you back, and it's been a fantastic discussion. We'd like to have you back again and have another session of a fantastic discussion next time. With that, why don't we express our appreciation to Carl Frey in our usual way. Thank you very much.